You are standing in the space between the sky and the earth. Look up. Somewhere above you, a woman's body arches across the entire heaven, her fingers touching one horizon, her toes touching the other. Look down. Beneath your feet, a man lies stretched out across the whole world, his body covered in green fields and grey stone. They cannot touch each other. They will never touch each other again. Once they were locked together so tightly that nothing could fit between them. No light, no air, no world at all. Something had to force them apart. And what happened next explains why, even now, 3,000 years after the last pharaoh died, Egyptians still looked up at an empty sky and saw something more than stars. They saw a wound that never healed. To understand that wound, you have to go back further than the sky, further than the earth, further than time itself. You have to go back to the water. Before Egypt, before the Nile, before the first grain of sand ever settled into place, there was only Nun. Nun was not a god you could see or touch. Nun was the water of nothing, dark, silent, and endless, stretching in every direction with no shore and no bottom. If you had somehow been floating inside it, you would not have been able to tell up from down, because there was no up and no down yet to tell apart. Ancient priests at the temple city the Egyptians called Unu, the place Greek travelers later renamed Heliopolis, spent their entire lives trying to explain how anything could come from that endless dark. Their answer began with one god. Atum. Nobody made Atum. Nobody gave birth to him. According to the oldest religious writings ever carved into stone, the pyramid texts, found inside the pyramid of a king named Unas at Saqqara and first translated by the French Egyptologist Gaston Maspero in 1881, Atum rose out of none by his own will alone. He pulled himself into existence on a single mound of dry ground, the very first solid thing in all of creation. Egyptians called it the Benben, and for thousands of years afterward they shaped the tips of their obelisks and their pyramids to copy its form. You can still see one of those obelisks standing in modern Cairo today, cut from red granite, raised almost 4,000 years ago, for a king named Senusret I, half buried in sand for centuries before the modern city grew up around it. If you ever stand beside it, you can run your hand across the same granite people touched 4,000 years ago. It is one of the last markers left of the place where this whole story supposedly began. Here is what most people miss. Atum did not have a wife. He did not have a partner. He was completely alone on that mound, in the middle of an ocean of nothing, and he still had to become a father. So he did the only thing he could. He created life from his own body. Ancient Egyptian priests were not shy about this detail. Through his own energy, alone and without a partner, Atum brought 2 children into the world, Shu, the god of air and space, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture and mist. For the very first time, there was something other than water and one lonely god. There was breath and there was wetness, the 2 ingredients every living thing would ever need. But then something went wrong. Shu and Tefnut wandered off into the dark water of Nun to explore it, and they got lost. Stay with me, because this part matters more than it sounds. Atum panicked. His only 2 children were gone somewhere inside an ocean with no edges. So he sent out his own eye, alone, glowing and searching to find them. We do not know exactly how long that search lasted. The old texts do not say. What they do say is what happened when the eye finally brought Shu and Tefnut home. Atum wept. He cried from pure relief, and where his tears touched the dry ground of the Benben mound, something new began to grow. Human beings. According to this belief, held for thousands of years by real people living along the Nile, you and I exist because a lonely god once cried tears of joy for his lost children. Modern Egyptologists, including Richard Wilkinson, who spent decades studying Egyptian religious texts, point to this myth as one of the clearest windows into how Egyptians saw themselves. Not as separate from their gods, but as something born directly out of a god's emotion. But it gets stranger. Shu and Tefnut grew up, and they had 2 children of their own. Geb, god of the earth, and Nut, goddess of the sky. And Geb and Nut did something their parents never did. They fell in love. Not the calm, distant love you might expect from cosmic forces. A desperate, physical love. The old stories describe them locked together in a permanent embrace, Geb's body pressed completely against Nut's, with no space between them at all. Why does that matter? Because Nut was the sky, and Geb was the earth, and if the sky and the earth are locked together with 0 space between them, there is nowhere for a world to exist. No room for air. No room for light. No room for Shu, their own father, whose entire identity was the space between earth and sky. Ra, the sun god, who by this point had risen to rule over all creation, could not accept it. Some versions of the story say Ra was jealous. Some say he was simply protecting Ma'at, the balance and order that held the universe together. Either way, his judgment was final. Shu was ordered to separate his own children. If you have ever loved someone and then watched them get pulled away from you by something bigger than both of you, you already know something close to what happens next. Picture it. Shu, god of air, standing between his son and his daughter while they cling to each other, and then, using every bit of his strength, forcing them apart. Pushing Nut upward until her body arched across the entire sky, her feet and hands the only parts still touching the world below. Pinning Geb down until he lay flat across the ground, forever staring up at the wife he could never hold again. This is the moment carved on temple ceilings across Egypt for 3,000 years. You have probably seen an image of it without knowing what you were looking at. Nut's body stretched overhead, covered in stars, held up by Shu. Geb lying beneath her, his body still tense with longing. It is one of the most repeated images in all of Egyptian art, and it is a picture of a father tearing his children apart. Here is one more thing that most explainer videos skip completely. Nut was already pregnant when Shu separated her from Geb, and Ra was not finished punishing them. Ra declared that Nut could never give birth, not on any day of the calendar. At that time, the Egyptian year only had 360 days, and Ra's curse covered every single one of them. Think about that. A mother carrying children inside her, sentenced to carry them forever. No day on earth was allowed to witness their birth. That is where we have to stop, because that curse does not stay broken forever. Somebody finds a way around it. And what gets born because of that trick changes Egyptian religion completely. We will pick that up in the next video. So why does any of this matter to you, someone living thousands of years later, who has never worshipped Ra, and never walked the streets of Yunu? Because every time you look up at a clear sky, you are looking at something Egyptians believed was a person. And if you have ever felt far away from someone you love, even in the same city or the same house, you already understand the feeling this myth was built to explain. A mother, permanently separated from the person she loved most, holding her body in that painful arch for eternity so that the rest of us would have somewhere to live. Every sunrise in their eyes was Nut swallowing the sun each night and giving birth to it again each morning, the closest thing to motherhood she had left. There are 3 things worth carrying with you from this story. First, the historical truth. This creation myth, recorded in the pyramid texts and repeated on temple walls for 3,000 years, was one of the oldest religious systems ever developed by human beings, older than the pyramids of Giza that came after it. Second, the human lesson. Even the Egyptians, standing at the very beginning of recorded history, understood that love and order do not always survive contact with power. Third, the feeling underneath it all. Separation. The ache of being close to someone and unable to reach them. Egyptians looked at the empty space of the sky and did not see nothing. They saw absence given a shape. Nut's curse is still sitting there, unresolved, 4 children waiting to be born on a calendar with no room for them. So tell me, if you were a god clever enough to outsmart the sun itself, how would you find 5 extra days that were never supposed to exist? We will answer that in the next video, and it is where this family's real tragedy begins.